The morning sun rose slowly over the village, its warm light spilling across thatched roofs and dirt paths, but it brought no comfort to the young girl whose life had already begun to unravel. She moved quietly through the narrow lanes, carrying baskets of herbs and fruits as she always did, tending to her daily chores with a grace and humility that had long marked her as someone different. And yet, it was this difference, this quiet strength, this innocence, that had drawn the attention of envious eyes. Among her neighbors, whispers had begun to spread like wildfire, fanned by fear, jealousy, and superstition. It started with small remarks, half-laughs about how she seemed to know things before others, how animals would gather around her as if understanding her words, or how the harvest she tended seemed always a little more bountiful. At first they were brushed off as simple village gossip, harmless and fleeting. But then came the tales that twisted her kindness into something sinister. People began claiming that she had cursed their goats to fall ill, or that the river rose unnaturally whenever she passed by. Old women muttered that the girl's shadow stretched longer than it should, moving independently of her body. Children spoke of seeing her hum to plants and flowers, which grew with unnatural speed. Fear is a dangerous thing, and in this village, it mingled with greed and resentment until it became a poison. Those who had once smiled at her now narrowed their eyes, watching for signs of her supposed treachery. If a basket of fruit fell, they whispered that it was her doing. If the fire flickered oddly in a home, they claimed it was her curse. Nothing was too small to escape scrutiny, and every mundane event was twisted to fit the narrative they were creating. The elders, though wise in years, did little to halt the spread of rumors, for they too had begun to feel the creeping unease that the villagers insisted was her doing. Jealousy too played its part. Families who had labored for years to maintain modest prosperity now saw her, the girl who spoke little yet radiated confidence, as a threat. Her beauty, her kindness, her apparent connection to the rhythms of nature, everything that set her apart also drew the eyes of those who wished ill. A neighbor whose daughter's hair never seemed as lush or whose crops never ripened as fully would sigh in envy and mutter accusations under her breath. Another, jealous that the girl's laughter seemed to lift the spirits of the community while their own scolding brought only fear, began to hint at darker intentions, suggesting that her influence could only come from unnatural sources. It was in the market that the first public accusation was made. A woman, her face red with indignation, stepped forward and in a voice that trembled between fear and triumph, claimed that the girl had bewitched her child. Others, sensing opportunity and eager to protect themselves from any imagined calamity, joined in. One by one villagers raised their voices, each adding their own tale of supposed wrongdoing. The stories became wilder with each telling, a tapestry of fear and suspicion that soon painted the girl as a menace, a witch in their midst. By midday, the village square had become a gathering of fearful eyes and wagging tongues. Elders, priests and common folk alike spoke in hurried tones, each embellishing the story, warning that if action was not taken, disaster would surely follow. They claimed to see signs in the sky, in the animals, in the wind itself, all pointing to her culpability. The young girl, bewildered and frightened, tried to speak, to defend herself, but her voice was drowned out by the clamor of fearful accusations. Even those who had once been her friends avoided her gaze, afraid that any association might draw the village's wrath upon themselves. Rumors reached every corner of the community, that she could summon storms, call death upon the livestock, or curse a family line with a mere glance. The whispers grew louder, fueled by imagination and malice, until it seemed that the entire village believed her to be the source of all misfortune. Fear had hardened into certainty and certainty into outrage. The girl, once a symbol of quiet resilience and innocence, became an object of suspicion and dread. By evening, the accusations had taken on a life of their own. The villagers, driven by a combination of fear, envy, and superstition, began to prepare for what they believed was an inevitable confrontation. They spoke of casting her out, of punishing her, of ridding themselves of the presence that had, in their minds, invited calamity into their lives. Every glance, every whisper, every glance at her shadowed figure became a mark of guilt in their eyes. The girl, though innocent and trembling, could see the storm gathering in the hearts of those around her. The entire village seemed to move against her and nowhere was safe. By nightfall, the seed of doom had been planted. The girl could feel it in the hush that fell over empty streets, in the sideways glances of those she passed, in the way the wind seemed to carry mocking echoes of the rumors. She realized with a chilling clarity that the village's jealousy and fear had combined to shape a verdict before any trial could take place. Her fate was no longer in the hands of justice, reason, or truth. It lay in the frenzy of a community consumed by its own dark imagination, and by the morning, that judgment would manifest in a way she could scarcely imagine. The village, once a place of warmth and routine, had become a cage of suspicion and wrath. By night, as shadows lengthened and stars blinked in the sky, every whispered story, every fearful glance, and every spark of envy coalesced into a single unstoppable force. The girl, accused and innocent, could only tremble as she understood the depth of the hatred that now defined her existence. And so, the stage was set, the villagers' hearts hardened, and the first act of tragedy was ready to unfold at the break of dawn. The first light of dawn crept hesitantly over the horizon, painting the village in muted shades of gold and rose. The air, heavy with anticipation and fear, carried whispers that seemed louder than the chirping of birds. The villagers had gathered in the central square, their faces a mixture of anger, apprehension, and grim satisfaction. At the center, bound and trembling, was the young girl, her eyes wide with disbelief, her chest heaving as she struggled to comprehend the enormity of the hatred that had built up around her. She had done nothing to deserve this, yet superstition, jealousy, and fear had conspired to place her here, at the mercy of her own people. The elders, dressed in ceremonial garb, formed a circle around her. Their expressions were stern, etched with the authority that came from years of guiding the community, yet even they betrayed unease. Some avoided her gaze, perhaps sensing the injustice that lay heavy in the air, while others spoke words of condemnation, their voices trembling with conviction as if fear alone could legitimize their actions. The villagers, a throng of men, women, and children, watched silently, some with trembling hands, others with a grim resolve that only comes from conformity in the face of mob judgment. Dragged forward by two of the strongest men in the village, she stumbled, her bare feet scraping against the dirt, leaving faint streaks of blood as small cuts from the rough ground opened. Her eyes darted to the sky, hoping for some divine intervention, some miracle to halt the unfolding nightmare, but the sun continued its slow climb, indifferent to her plight. Each step toward the designated place of execution seemed endless, her heart pounding louder than any voice in the square. She was a lone figure against the mass, fragile and human, and yet there was a quiet dignity in the way she lifted her head, refusing to let despair fully claim her. The elders began a chant, low and solemn, invoking the gods and spirits of the ancestors to witness the act. Their voices were rhythmic, almost hypnotic, a blend of ritual and authority designed to justify the cruelty. The villagers joined in, their own murmurs merging into a single, ominous tide that pressed against the girl from all sides. Every syllable, every beat of the chant, seemed to deepen the weight upon her shoulders, each word a reminder that escape was impossible. The morning air, which should have brought light and hope, was thick with tension and the metallic scent of fear. When the ritual reached its peak, the girl was forced to kneel, her head bowed under the judgmental gaze of those around her. A sharp stone altar had been prepared, and the executioner, hands trembling slightly despite his outward composure, raised a weapon that gleamed in the rising sun. There was a collective intake of breath from the crowd, a moment suspended between life and death. She tried to speak, to plead, but her voice was drowned by the chant and the murmurs of the masses, powerless against the tide of superstition and anger that had condemned her. Then, in an instant, the act was carried out. The weapon descended with a finality that reverberated through the silent square. Her body crumpled to the earth, a crimson stain spreading across the soil, soaking into the ground as though the land itself sought to absorb the injustice. For a moment, time seemed to pause. The birds froze mid-flight, the wind held its breath, and even the sun appeared to hesitate in the sky, as if the natural world itself recoiled at the cruelty. The villagers, who had anticipated triumph, found themselves confronted by the stark reality of their actions. The vibrant life of a young woman extinguished, and yet, somehow, the weight of her innocence seemed to linger, haunting the very ground where she had fallen. The elders pronounced her guilt one final time, their voices ringing hollow in the aftermath. Some villagers turned away, unable to witness the aftermath of their own hands. Others stared in stunned silence, confronted by the magnitude of the deed. There was no applause, no sense of achievement, only the echo of a life violently ended and the oppressive knowledge that such an act could not go unnoticed by the spirits of the earth or the gods they claimed to honor. Even as they began to prepare the burial, the earth itself seemed to respond. Small tremors shifted the dirt around her fallen form, the wind whispered through the trees with a mournful sigh, and animals in the vicinity grew restless, as if aware that something sacred had been violated. A hush fell over the square, broken only by the low cries of the few children who had watched, confused and terrified by the violence imposed upon someone they had admired. The act, meant to be a display of authority and justice, instead became a mark of horror that would stain the memory of the village for years to come. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the square, the villagers dispersed, carrying with them a mixture of relief and unease. They had committed an atrocity under the guise of ritual and tradition, yet the weight of the deed pressed upon them, heavy and unshakable. The girl lay motionless, her blood mingling with the soil, her spirit poised to transcend the mortal realm, to become something far greater and far more terrifying than any of them could have imagined. The stage was set for the reckoning that would come with dusk, when the boundaries between life and spirit blurred, and the consequences of their cruelty would manifest in ways no mortal hand could contain. The villagers, still shaken from the gruesome events of dawn, wasted no time with ceremonial rites or respectful farewells. They carried the girl's lifeless body outside the boundaries of the village, to a piece of land considered cursed and forbidden by local custom. The place was a barren stretch, where no crops thrived and no animals lingered, a parcel of earth that the elders themselves avoided except in times of grave necessity. Here, they believed, the disposal of someone deemed impure or dangerous could be accomplished without angering the spirits of the living village. And yet, even in their haste, an unease gripped their hearts. The air seemed heavier, the wind sharper, and the shadows deeper, as if the earth itself sensed the injustice being imposed upon the girl. As the body was laid upon the cold, uneven soil, the villagers did not kneel or pray. No incantations were offered, no words of remembrance spoken. They treated her not as a person but as an object to be discarded, a problem to be erased from sight. Her hair, once a flowing testament to her youth, fell in tangled strands across the dirt. Her hands, small and delicate, remained stained with the dust of her own struggle. The villagers worked quickly, shovels biting into the unyielding ground as they covered her in hurried heaps of earth, the act mechanical and devoid of compassion. Yet even as they buried her, the girl's spirit, though invisible to mortal eyes, stirred with a restlessness that the villagers could not perceive. Every shovel of soil seemed to deepen the injustice rather than conceal it. The wind shifted through the barren land, carrying faint murmurs, the sort of whispers that travel just beyond hearing. Some of the villagers felt a chill in their bones, a sensation of eyes watching from beneath the mound of earth. Most dismissed it, muttering to themselves that the wind was simply capricious, that the land had no memory. But a few, sensitive or perhaps already unnerved by the earlier horrors, felt the weight of the girl's presence pressing against their very souls. They glanced around nervously, but no one dared speak aloud for fear of drawing attention or inviting accusation themselves. The silence of the burial was eerie. The only sounds were the scraping of shovels, the crunch of boots on dry earth, and the occasional muttered curse from those burdened by the ritual of disposal. The villagers moved as a single, uneasy unit, as though their collective fear could be channeled into efficiency. Yet the earth refused to receive her passively. Roots shifted under the fresh soil, tiny fissures cracked along the uneven ground, and a faint, persistent moan seemed to rise from beneath the surface. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but enough to prick at the nerves of the more observant, who sensed that the girl's spirit had not surrendered, that she had not left the world even as her body succumbed to its final resting place. By the time the burial was complete, the sun had risen higher, casting a harsh light over the barren patch. The villagers stepped back, surveying the shallow mound that marked the girl's final resting place. It was a hurried job, corners uneven, soil loose, as if in their haste they had tried to expel the memory of her existence as quickly as possible. No flowers adorned the grave, no offerings lay beside it. She was to be forgotten, erased from memory, reduced to nothing but a pile of dirt and a fading shadow. And yet, the wind continued to carry a soft, almost musical sigh through the mound, and the air around it seemed charged with a strange energy. The children, who had been kept at a distance, peeked from behind walls and fences, sensing something odd about the place. A few whispered of hearing faint cries or seeing shadows shift where none should be. They were too young to fully articulate fear, yet old enough to feel the sting of unease in their stomachs, a visceral understanding that the burial was not ordinary. Even the animals avoided the area, refusing to graze nearby, their instinct sensing the unnatural disturbance that lingered where life had been violently extinguished. As the villagers departed, a tense quiet settled over the land. No songs were sung, no laughter shared, and no solace was found in the act of disposal. The girl's cries may have been silenced physically, yet her spirit remained unbound, restless, aware of every movement and every heartbeat of those who had wronged her. That restless energy coiled beneath the earth, like a serpent waiting to strike, a memory of cruelty that refused to fade. Nightfall approached, and with it, a creeping dread that none of the villagers could articulate. Even in their homes, behind closed doors and bolted windows, they felt it, an imperceptible pressure, a sensation of being observed, a whisper brushing against the edges of perception. Some dismissed it as imagination or guilt, while others felt it in their very bones, a warning that death could not erase the injustice, that the girl's essence had transcended her mortal form. The mound of earth, shallow and hastily formed, became a silent monument not just to her death but to her undying presence. It was a reminder that cruelty leaves traces, that injustice cannot be buried with soil alone. The girl, though slain and hidden from sight, had entered a realm beyond the understanding of the living, poised to exact the reckoning that the villagers had tried so desperately to avoid. Her cries, silenced to the mortal ear, resonated through the very fibers of the earth, carrying with them the promise of vengeance, patience, and eternal awareness of every slight, every insult, every act of cruelty perpetrated against her innocent life. The village awoke the day after the girl's silent burial to an air thick with unease, though most tried to mask it behind the routines of daily life. The sun rose in pale streaks, casting light on streets and homes that suddenly felt smaller, more oppressive. From the first moments of morning, subtle anomalies began to emerge. Shadows lingered longer than they should, stretching unnaturally along walls and across the ground, seemingly moving independently of the objects that cast them. A sense of being watched settled over the village like a dense fog, prickling the skin and making even the bravest villager glance nervously over their shoulder. Animals, once docile and predictable, now acted strangely. Chickens refused to peck at the ground, their heads craned unnaturally upward, eyes fixed on some invisible point in the distance. Dogs whimpered and cowered in corners, ears flat against their heads, growling at shadows that flickered along walls. Cats hissed and arched their backs, their fur bristling as if in response to a presence only they could sense. Livestock became restless, straining at their tethers, snorting and stamping in fear. Even birds seemed unsettled, circling overhead in irregular patterns, their cries sharper and more urgent than usual. The villagers tried to attribute this behavior to superstition, or perhaps a change in weather, but deep down, a gnawing sense of dread took root. Children, more sensitive to the unseen, were the first to hear her voice. Soft whispers drifted on the wind as they played near the edges of the village, faint syllables that seemed to call their names or recount fragments of the tragedy. Some children froze mid-step, staring in confusion and fear at empty spaces, their small hands clutching at their parents for reassurance. Yet when the adults approached, nothing seemed there. The whispers vanished, leaving only a lingering chill that crawled along the spine. A few of the older children described seeing fleeting glimpses of a girl-like figure in the corner of their vision, only for it to vanish when they looked directly. Rumors spread quickly among them, carried like sparks in dry grass, that the girl had not truly departed, that her spirit had risen from the earth to haunt those who had wronged her. The villagers themselves were not immune. Doors that had been securely closed would creak open of their own accord. Windows would rattle as if a wind gusted through, though the day remained unnaturally still. Footsteps echoed in empty streets, shadows flitted past doorways, and objects seemed to shift subtly from where they had been placed. The more people tried to rationalize these occurrences, the more evident it became that something beyond their understanding had taken root in their village. Fear, previously simmering under layers of denial, now began to seep into every aspect of life. Even mundane activities like fetching water or tending to livestock were tinged with unease. Wells, previously sources of refreshment, seemed darker, the water's surface reflecting more than just the sky. Buckets tipped as if by invisible hands, and tools left on the ground shifted overnight to new positions. Villagers whispered about eyes in the shadows, about fingers brushing their hair when none were present. Some dared to venture near the burial mound outside the village, only to retreat trembling, claiming the air there was heavier, the earth beneath their feet pulsing as if alive. In the market square, whispers and rumors grew louder. Those who had avoided the girl's death initially now found themselves enmeshed in a subtle web of fear. Transactions were hushed, voices lowered, and eyes constantly flicked to corners where shadows pooled unnaturally. Even the simplest of interactions, a shared glance, a passing greeting, felt laden with tension, as though one wrong movement might summon her presence directly. People began to avoid areas of the village they once passed daily without thought, rerouting paths to circumvent places where shadows clustered or the wind carried a strange murmur. The elders, usually the pillars of calm and wisdom, were unsettled in ways they could not fully explain. They muttered prayers beneath their breath, burned incense and performed minor rites meant to appease spirits, but the phenomena persisted. The village's collective unease grew, each day blending seamlessly into the next without relief. Even those who had been skeptical at first began to sense the inexorable weight of her unrest. Her spirit, once confined to the realm of the dead, now appeared to have reached into the waking world, asserting her presence in ways that could not be ignored. By midday, tension had escalated into palpable dread. Families huddled within their homes, children clinging to parents, and adults moving with careful deliberation. No one dared speak of the burial openly, yet every movement, every glance, every creak and rustle reminded them of her existence. Shadows lengthened unnaturally under the sun's glare, and wherever a slight wind passed through the village, it carried with it the faintest hint of her voice, soft but piercing, reminding all who heard it of the injustice committed. By evening, even the bravest villagers had come to realize that her spirit was not confined to her grave. The earth had not claimed her completely. Instead, she had risen, her essence intertwined with the land, the wind, and the lingering air of the village. No prayer, no hurried burial, no ritualistic avoidance could diminish the power she now wielded. The whispers in the daylight were only the beginning, a prelude to the reckoning that would follow once night fell and her presence could fully manifest. The villagers, once confident in their authority over life and death, were forced to confront a terrifying reality. The girl they had slain at dawn remained very much alive in spirit, observing, whispering, and slowly reclaiming power over the lives of those who had wronged her. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in muted shades of crimson and gold, the village tried to resume a semblance of normalcy. Families gathered around their evening fires and simple meals, attempting to focus on routine and suppress the gnawing unease that had taken root since dawn. The air was thick with the smells of cooking, roasted grains, smoke from clay stoves, and the faint aroma of herbs, but even these comforting scents failed to mask the tension that pressed upon every villager's chest. Conversations were tentative and fractured, words trailing off mid-sentence, replaced by uncomfortable silence. The children, still wary from the events of the day, clung to their parents' sides, their small hands grasping tightly at sleeves and skirts. Their eyes darted nervously toward the shadows cast by flickering fires and the dimming light outside. Even in the familiar spaces of home, the corners seemed darker, deeper, and more alive. Every creak of wood, every rustle of leaves carried the potential for something unseen to emerge. Though the adults tried to dismiss it as imagination or fatigue, the sensation was undeniable. The girl's spirit, restless and unyielding, had not remained buried in the forbidden ground. Elders muttered under their breaths, performing hurried prayers and minor protective rites, but their actions did little to alleviate the pervasive dread. Some elders avoided looking directly at the fire, convinced that the shadows leaping along the walls might conceal something more than mere darkness. Their voices, low and tremulous, spoke of omens, of unsettled spirits, and of consequences that no mortal authority could forestall. The younger villagers listened uneasily, unsure whether to believe these words or consider them superstition, but deep inside, a growing chill gnawed at their resolve, an instinctive recognition that something unnatural lingered beyond the veil of night. As the meal progressed, subtle signs of the girl's presence began to manifest. Utensils would shift slightly when no hand had touched them, a faint whisper floated just beyond earshot, and shadows along walls seemed to twist and pulse independently. The air itself felt heavy, charged with energy, and a soft, almost musical hum threaded its way through the gathering. Some villagers exchanged nervous glances, while others tried to rationalize the occurrences, attributing the sounds to wind, the shifting shadows to uneven light. But even the most skeptical could not entirely ignore the growing tension. The conversation around the tables dwindled further, replaced by the uneasy rhythm of glances and whispered murmurs. Children whispered to one another about the voice they had heard calling their names, and a few of the elders, with furrowed brows, hinted that the girl's spirit might be exacting justice. No one dared speak openly, fearing that acknowledgement might draw her attention more directly. Yet the longer they sat in silence, the more the air seemed to tighten around them, pressing down, making each breath shallow and each movement deliberate. Outside the huts, nature itself seemed to participate in the unsettling vigil. Trees rustled in the fading light, their leaves trembling without wind. The faint rustle of animals moving through the underbrush punctuated the stillness, as though creatures shared the unease permeating the village. Even the earth beneath the village homes felt alive, responding subtly to the presence of the restless spirit buried just beyond their sight. Small tremors occasionally passed underfoot, unnoticed by some, but sending shivers down the spines of those attuned to the unnatural shifts. As dusk deepened, the girl's influence grew stronger. Her essence, connected to the very soil where she had been hastily buried, seeped into the atmosphere. Shadows thickened and moved with an unnatural intelligence, pooling near doorways and windows, curling around beams and walls. The villagers' eyes were drawn involuntarily toward these shapes, hearts quickening with the unspoken realization that they were not alone. Some dared to glance at the burial mound outside the village, only to feel a wave of icy dread that forced them to avert their gaze. The atmosphere at each table became almost suffocating, a tangible weight pressing upon shoulders and knees alike. A sense of inevitability began to spread. No matter how much the villagers tried to maintain composure, the girl's spirit, her anguish, and her rage were poised to assert themselves. Every bite of food, every sip of water, every shared word of laughter or conversation seemed tainted, overshadowed by the awareness of her watching presence. Some whispered quietly that perhaps justice could not be avoided, that the girl's suffering demanded recognition and repayment in ways they could not yet understand. By the time darkness fully enveloped the village, the atmosphere had transformed into one thick with fear and anticipation. The villagers, though physically seated around their meals, were spiritually elsewhere, preoccupied with shadows, whispers, and the unnerving feeling of being observed. Their attempts to ignore the past day's horrors had failed, replaced by the mounting certainty that the girl's spirit had not only survived but was poised to act. The dishes on their tables sat largely untouched, their appetites lost to the growing dread, while a soft wind carried a faint, mournful cry from the direction of the forbidden ground. In those final moments of daylight, the village collectively understood that the reckoning was near. The girl, slain at dawn and buried without respect, had not vanished. She lingered in the twilight, her spirit drawing power from the injustice that had been done to her, preparing to rise and confront those who had mocked, betrayed, and silenced her. The unease that gripped the villagers was no longer simple fear, it was the forewarning of a supernatural judgment, an inescapable reckoning that would mark the night with terror and awe. As twilight deepened into night, the village, still tense from the day's unsettling occurrences, settled into a nervous hush. Families gathered around their evening fires and tables, food barely touched, eyes constantly flicking toward the shadows. The unease that had grown throughout the day now reached a palpable crescendo, a heavy tension pressing on every shoulder, every chest. Children clung to their parents, adults whispered half-formed prayers under their breath, and even the elders, usually composed in the face of superstition, could not hide the tremor in their hands. Then, as if the air itself parted to announce her presence, she appeared. The girl, slain at dawn and buried without respect, now sat at her old place at the table. It was as though she had risen from the earth, her body calm and composed, yet her presence radiated a chilling authority. Shadows seemed to coil and sway around her like living tendrils, responding to her mere existence. The dim light of the fire flickered, casting her face in partial darkness, yet her eyes glowed faintly, illuminating the terror they reflected in those who dared look directly at her. The villagers froze. No one dared move, speak, or even breathe. The air was thick with a silence that pressed against their eardrums, a quiet so heavy it seemed to echo with the unshed cries of the girl herself. Her calm demeanor contrasted starkly with the horror she inspired. She did not shout, did not wave, did not raise her hand. Yet every movement, even the slightest tilt of her head, conveyed a command, an unspoken warning that the slightest defiance would be met with unthinkable consequence. Around the table, shadows deepened unnaturally. Candles flickered and sputtered, flames bending away from her presence. The walls of the hut seemed to contract, leaning inward as if drawn by some invisible force toward the center where she sat. The villagers felt the weight of her stare on them, a presence that seemed to pierce the very fabric of their beings. Hearts pounded violently in chests, palms grew clammy, and knees threatened to buckle, but no one dared show weakness or flee. The girl's spirit had claimed the room entirely, it was hers, and all who remained were mere intruders in her domain. The air carried a faint, almost imperceptible hum, a sound that seemed to vibrate in tune with the pounding of every heartbeat. Whispers, faint at first, rose and fell like distant waves, echoing words of accusation, regret, and fear. The villagers recognized fragments, phrases they had once spoken aloud, lies and betrayals whispered under breath. Moments of cruelty now returned to haunt them. Every glance at the girl, seated with unshakable calm, reminded them of their complicity in her death, their failure to protect innocence, and the cruelty that had sealed their fate. Children trembled under the weight of the supernatural display. They sensed, more clearly than the adults, that this was not a mere vision but a true manifestation of the girl's will. Even those who had been skeptical throughout the day could not deny the reality before them. She was there, fully present and yet untouchable. Her spirit carried with it a power that no living force could challenge, and in that stillness, a lesson was imparted without a word. Justice had not died with her body, it had transcended mortality, and it was inexorable. The villagers' attempts at prayer or whispered supplications were futile. The words seemed to vanish into the shadows before they could be fully formed, absorbed by the dense energy that surrounded her. Some tried to avert their gaze, covering eyes with trembling hands, yet the haunting calm of her presence drew them back involuntarily. She did not speak, yet the weight of her judgment was undeniable. Every thought, every movement, every heartbeat was measured, assessed, and silently condemned by the sheer force of her existence. As minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the atmosphere grew colder, denser. The firelight dimmed to a soft glow, and yet her presence did not waver. It was as if the night itself bowed to her, every shadow and flicker of light bending around the unshakable figure at the table. Villagers who had previously mocked, betrayed, or harmed her felt the full weight of their actions pressing down, guilt and fear intertwining into a suffocating grip. Their muscles tensed, their voices caught in their throats, their minds racing for escape that could not exist. Outside, the wind carried the faintest echoes of her voice, soft and almost melodic, yet imbued with a terrifying authority. Leaves rustled in response, and the faintest tremors ran through the ground beneath the village, as if nature itself was responding to her presence. Even the animals, previously restless during the day, crouched silently, sensing the dominance of a spirit no mortal could challenge. The girl at the table became both the center of attention and the unseen arbiter of justice, her calm radiating power that penetrated every corner of the hut and, symbolically, every heart in the village. Time lost meaning as the villagers remained frozen in terror and awe. The girl's spirit, calm yet terrifying, communicated the consequences of cruelty without uttering a single word. Each flicker of her shadow, each subtle movement of her form, reinforced the certainty that retribution was not just possible, it was inevitable. The realization settled heavily on every mind present. The girl they had slain at dawn was no longer powerless. She was eternal, present, and fully aware of every slight, every act of cruelty, every betrayal they had committed. As night fully enveloped the village, her presence remained unyielding. No one dared leave, no one dared challenge, and no one dared breathe too loudly. The meal, once an ordinary moment of sustenance, had become a stage for supernatural reckoning. The girl's calm demeanor belied the immense power she wielded, a force that would not rest until justice was complete. In that chilling stillness, the villagers understood the profound truth. They were no longer masters of their fate, it belonged entirely to the spirit they had wronged. As the night deepened, the flickering firelight cast long, dancing shadows across the faces of the villagers gathered in tense silence. Every flicker seemed to twist and stretch unnaturally, bending toward the girl's ethereal form as if the very flames acknowledged her presence. Her calm, terrifying visage at the table was now accompanied by a palpable intensity that pressed upon everyone in the room. The villagers sat frozen, their eyes wide, bodies rigid, and breaths shallow. Each heartbeat seemed to echo in the stillness, mingling with the faint, almost imperceptible hum that had begun to emanate from her spirit. Then, slowly, deliberately she began to speak. Her voice was soft yet carried an unyielding authority, resonating through the hut like the distant roll of thunder. The first name she uttered caused a ripple of fear to surge through the room. It was a name that each person instantly recognized, someone who had taken part in her death or had turned a blind eye to the cruelty she suffered. The syllables hung in the air, weighty and accusatory, as though the sound itself could inflict punishment. The villagers instinctively recoiled, their faces blanching, palms pressing to their mouths, yet none dared interrupt, none dared speak. One by one she called the names of the guilty. Each name brought with it a shiver of dread, a tightening of the chest, and an almost tangible feeling of doom pressing down on the accused. The girl's eyes, glowing faintly in the firelight, seemed to bore directly into the souls of those she named. Her gaze did not merely see them, it penetrated their thoughts, their fears, their deepest regrets. The air grew heavier with every utterance, thickening as if it were a living entity responding to the injustice that had been done. Even those who had been innocent bystanders feared the weight of her scrutiny, sensing that complicity in silence might not go unnoticed. The fire flickered violently, casting her shadow across the walls, which seemed to expand and writhe as she spoke. Each name echoed through the room multiple times, layering over itself like the tolling of a bell, a reminder that the consequences were inescapable. Whispers of remorse, panic, and unspoken confessions began to spill from the mouths of the guilty, though no one dared to speak them aloud. Their minds raced, memories of the day she was slain colliding with the present terror, each recollection magnified by the supernatural weight of her presence. Outside, the wind picked up as though answering her call. It whipped through the village, rustling leaves, rattling shutters, and sending a chill that crept beneath doors and around corners. Even the earth seemed to respond, faint tremors vibrating through the wooden floors, echoing in tune with her voice. The villagers felt as though the entire environment had become an extension of her will, a living, breathing accomplice in the reckoning she was meting out. Fear was no longer just a sensation, it was an all-encompassing force, wrapping around each person with unrelenting grip. As the naming continued, those called upon by her spirit began to tremble uncontrollably. Hands shook, knees weakened, and their eyes darted frantically toward the walls and ceilings, seeking escape from the weight of their guilt. They realized too late that no movement, no hiding, could shield them from the justice being pronounced. Each name not only identified the perpetrator but also summoned a creeping dread that seemed to manifest physically, a tightening in the chest, a cold brush along the spine, and a sensation as if unseen hands were pressing them down into the earth. The children, who had previously clung silently to their parents, now looked on with wide, fearful eyes, sensing the gravity of the moment without fully understanding it. The youngest whimpered softly, the sound swallowed immediately by the oppressive air. Even they recognized that the girl's spirit was no ordinary presence. It carried power beyond mortal comprehension, an unyielding force that demanded recognition, respect, and submission. The elders, their usual composure shattered, whispered hurried prayers under their breath, though the words seemed futile, absorbed and nullified by the omnipotent force that sat before them. As the list of names grew, the air grew almost suffocating, thick with the tension of anticipation and dread. Every villager, whether named or merely present, felt the creeping certainty that the girl's vengeance would not be limited to the spoken accusations. Each syllable, each resonant utterance, was charged with intent, shaping the unseen forces that hovered in the shadows. The hut seemed to vibrate subtly, walls pulsating with the rhythm of her voice, shadows deepening and coiling like serpents ready to strike. By the time the final names were spoken, the villagers were paralyzed, minds racing, hearts hammering in their chests. Some had fallen to their knees, others pressed faces into their hands, and a few stared into the distance, unblinking as if frozen in a nightmare from which there could be no escape. The girl's presence, calm yet terrifying, left no room for denial or disbelief. The reckoning had begun, and the air itself seemed to whisper in her voice, repeating each name, magnifying the dread, and solidifying the inevitability of their punishment. The villagers understood, in the deepest recesses of their being, that the act of naming was not merely symbolic. It was the opening of a channel through which justice, supernatural and unavoidable, would flow. Each name uttered was a seed, planted in the fertile soil of fear and guilt, destined to grow into consequences that no human hand could mitigate. The night had transformed into a stage for reckoning, and the girl, slain at dawn but risen at dusk, held the reins of power. The night hung heavy over the village, thick with fear and suffocating dread. The air, still vibrating with the resonance of the girl's voice as she named the guilty, now seemed charged with an unseen, terrible energy. Those she had identified could feel it pressing against them like a living weight, a judgment that was immediate, inescapable, and merciless. Each of her tormentors, trembling and pale, became acutely aware that the reckoning had moved from words to reality. Their eyes darted around the dimly lit rooms and across the shadowed village, searching for some human explanation, some loophole that could save them, but none existed. The first of the guilty tried to call out, stammering pleas for mercy, but the words stuck in their throat. Their food, which had barely been touched during the tense evening meal, began to convulse violently in the plate before them. Unseen hands seemed to manipulate it, shaping it into choking forms that defied reason. They gasped, their hands clutched at their throats, eyes bulging in terror as their body betrayed them. The villagers, paralyzed with fear, could only watch as the supernatural justice unfolded in horrifying clarity. The sound of strangled gasps mingled with the crackle of the fire, a chilling symphony that marked the beginning of divine retribution. Shadows in the corners of the hut stirred, twisting unnaturally. They lengthened and thickened, reaching toward those who had participated in the girl's death. One man, notorious for his cruelty, felt a tendril of darkness wrap around his ankle. It slithered upward with impossible speed, constricting and pulling, dragging him toward the floor. Panic seized him, but the more he struggled, the tighter the shadows coiled, entwining him like a living net. His screams echoed through the night, piercing the hearts of all who listened, a warning that no act of cruelty could remain hidden from the girl's relentless vengeance. Others experienced a more insidious fate. Some were struck by sudden exhaustion, their limbs collapsing as if an invisible weight pressed down upon them. They fell lifelessly to the earth, unable to move, to call for help, or even to resist. Their eyes, wide with shock and disbelief, reflected the realization that their actions had summoned forces far beyond human understanding. The village itself seemed to shudder, the wind howling through the gaps in the huts and rustling the trees in an unnatural cadence, responding to the girl's silent command. Animals, previously restless or indifferent, now joined in the eerie orchestration of punishment. Dogs barked at empty spaces, flinching as invisible forces shifted around them. Birds swooped low over the rooftops, their calls harsh and discordant, warning of the imminent consequences that each of the guilty would face. Even the earth seemed to participate, small tremors rippling through the ground, echoing the girl's wrath and signaling to all that no part of the village would remain untouched by her power. The mother, who had survived the day's earlier horrors, watched from a shadowed doorway, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. She could sense the intricate weaving of supernatural justice, understanding that each fate was perfectly tailored to the sins committed. Food choked the greedy, shadows consumed the cruel, and sudden collapse claimed the physically and morally weak. The punishments were precise, symbolic, and terrifyingly effective, leaving no room for doubt that the girl's spirit had become an instrument of unstoppable retribution. Even those who had remained silent witnesses to the cruelty could feel the pressure mounting. A quiet, almost imperceptible vibration ran through the air, aligning with their racing hearts. They knew that avoidance or denial would not save them. Complicity in cruelty, even through silence, carried weight in the reckoning now unfolding. The entire village was transformed into a stage of justice, each individual a player bound by the invisible threads of her supernatural authority. The scene outside the main huts mirrored the chaos within. Those attempting to flee were met with sudden gusts of wind that knocked them off balance, or shadows that lunged from the corners of the forest, wrapping around them like living chains. Screams of terror intertwined with the rustling of leaves and the distant howling of nocturnal creatures, forming a symphony of horror that resonated throughout the village. Every stone, tree, and building seemed to vibrate in recognition of her power, reinforcing the fact that no corner of their world was safe from the consequences of cruelty. In the central hut, the girl's spirit remained calm yet terrifying. She did not raise her hand or speak a single word. Her mere presence directed the punishment. The weight of her wrath was absolute, a manifestation of her righteous indignation made flesh. The guilty could feel it penetrate their bones, corrode their courage, and crush their very essence. No plea, no offering, no prayer could alter the fates being delivered. Every gasp, every convulsion, every collapse served as both punishment and lesson, a demonstration of the consequences of betrayal, cruelty, and injustice. The villagers who witnessed the unfolding retribution were left in a state of complete and paralyzing awe. The firelight flickered violently across terrified faces, highlighting wide eyes, clenched jaws, and trembling hands. Some fell to their knees, overcome by fear and remorse, unable to look upon the girl's spirit yet unable to turn away. They understood that justice, once awakened, was inescapable and perfect in its execution. The punishments, while supernatural, were deeply symbolic, tied intricately to the nature of each wrong committed. As the night wore on, the chaos gradually subsided, leaving only the echoes of screams, the faint crackle of extinguishing fires, and the lingering weight of terror in the air. The girl's spirit remained seated at the table, calm, her gaze sweeping over the village with quiet satisfaction. Her justice had been executed, precise and unrelenting. The surviving villagers, marked forever by what they had witnessed, knew that the memory of this night would linger for generations. The lesson was clear: cruelty to the innocent would never be forgotten, and the girl, though slain at dawn, had risen to enforce a justice that was absolute and eternal. The dawn after the night of reckoning broke with an eerie stillness. The village, once bustling with life and chatter, now lay heavy with a silence that pressed against every hut, every path, and every lingering soul. The surviving villagers moved like ghosts among the ruins of what had been their normal lives, their steps hesitant, their eyes darting constantly toward shadows that seemed to stretch and twist with intent. Even the wind carried a weight, whispering through the trees and rattling the shutters in a cadence that mimicked faint murmurs, as if the girl's spirit lingered in every gust. Those who had lived through her wrath felt a presence that was impossible to ignore. It was subtle at first, a flicker in the corner of the eye, a sudden shiver when no wind blew, a soft pressure that seemed to press upon the chest in moments of stillness. But as days passed, the awareness became oppressive. Every meal they ate felt observed, every shadow in the room seemed to whisper her name, and even the act of sleep became fraught with uneasy dreams of her calm, terrifying gaze. The village itself, once a place of comfort, had become a living testament to their guilt, the landscape echoing with the remnants of supernatural justice. Families huddled in fear during daylight hours, but it was the evening that brought the greatest terror. As dusk fell, the shadows deepened unnaturally, twisting into shapes that resembled her calm yet unyielding form. The survivors would glance up from their chores or their meals, their eyes catching the faint outlines of her ethereal presence, always sitting, always watching. The sense of being monitored was relentless. Even those who had once been indifferent to her suffering felt an overwhelming anxiety that their thoughts, their intentions, and their very movements were not their own. Conversations became cautious, stilted, and minimal. Villagers spoke in hushed tones, careful not to draw attention to themselves or to invoke the spirit's ire. The once familiar streets now carried the weight of fear, with doorways and alleys taking on menacing qualities. Even those who had been innocent witnesses to her death felt the pressure of her unseen eyes. They began to notice subtle signs. Chairs moved slightly when unattended, dishes shifted as if nudged by invisible hands, and the faint scent of her presence lingered in rooms long after she had appeared. The survivors' minds teetered on the edge of sanity, each fleeting shadow or whisper threatening to unravel their reason. Children, the most vulnerable among them, spoke of hearing her voice calling from the corners of the village. Soft, melodic at first, the voice soon twisted into a chilling tone that demanded recognition. Parents, too terrified to investigate, would grasp their children tightly, whispering promises of protection that felt hollow even to themselves. Yet the warnings of the spirit went beyond fear, they carried lessons. Each whispered name, each subtle movement of the shadows, reminded the villagers that cruelty, betrayal, and injustice left marks far beyond the physical realm. Every meal became a ritual fraught with tension. Survivors would sit at the table, knives trembling in their hands, feeling the piercing gaze of her spirit upon them. Food, once a source of sustenance, now became a reminder of their mortality and vulnerability. No morsel was eaten without a sense of dread, as though the act itself might summon her wrath once more. Shadows seemed to linger at the edges of their vision, the subtle shifting suggesting that the girl's spirit was seated among them, calm yet terrifying, waiting, judging, and reinforcing the lesson of her vengeance. Sleep brought no reprieve. The villagers dreamt of her appearing at the edges of their beds, her calm presence imposing, her eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Some dreamed of the night of her death, reliving the horror and their helplessness in vivid, agonizing detail. Others dreamt of her seated silently at their dinner tables, her gaze measuring and unyielding, her presence an ever-present reminder that they could never escape the consequences of their actions. Night after night, they awoke drenched in sweat, hearts pounding, with the sensation that she had been watching them even in their sleep. In time, the survivors adapted to this omnipresent fear, but it never left them. They walked with heads bowed, voices soft, and movements cautious, as though the girl's spirit lingered in every shadow, ready to act should their thoughts or deeds stray from the memory of justice she had enforced. Even the environment seemed to respond to their awareness. The wind, the flickering firelight, and the restless animals all reminded them that the village was no longer simply a place of human habitation. It was a domain under her watchful gaze. The scars of her vengeance were etched into the psyche of every survivor. They carried her memory everywhere, in the tilt of their heads, in the nervous twitch of their hands, in the quickened pulse when a shadow shifted unnaturally. Each day, each meal, each quiet moment became a lesson in humility and fear. Even those who had sought to erase her memory or justify their actions could not escape it. The girl, slain at dawn but risen in spirit at dusk, had embedded herself into the very fabric of the village, ensuring that her justice would not be forgotten. Generations later, the survivors would recount the tales of her spirit at the table, the whispered names, and the oppressive presence that haunted their every step. Her vengeance was not merely a story of retribution. It became an enduring lesson of morality, fear, and respect. The childless elders, the trembling youth, the cautious parents, all carried the weight of her memory. The village learned to live under the shadow of a power that transcended death, where every glance, every whisper, and every shadow could be the manifestation of the girl they had slain.